Those of you who weren't around for its release likely have no idea how mind-blowing playing a game on the Nintendo 64 was when it first hit the shelves. Yes, the Super NES had markedly improved graphics over the NES, but it was still an incremental improvement. Playing the N64, however, felt as though you had been catapulted decades into the future, and there were so many great games to play on launch day. Games like Super Mario 64, Pilot Wing 64, and, well, that's about it. The N64 had a major software drought for much of its first year, and for all of its lifespan, the console was constantly plagued by a lack of third-party titles, leading to it having one of the smallest libraries of any Nintendo console. We were promised quality over quantity, but at times it felt like we were getting neither of those things, which brings us to today's video about Cruis'n USA, released for the N64 in December of 1996. Why, you ask? Why Cruis'n USA? Why now? Well, I never played this game as a child, but it always sticks out in my mind as one of the first N64 games to review badly, a kind of bellwether for the troubles the console was going to face in the future. IGN gave it 4 out of 10, stating, "This game is probably doomed to be the nadir of N64 racing games for many years to come. Rent it for a few hours of fun, but don't waste your money on it." Computer and Video Games magazine gave it 1 out of 5, writing, "Cruis'n comes across as a poorly revised version of the classic Outrun, minus the great tunes and thrills." N64 magazine gave it a dismal score of 24%, opening their review by saying that, "Emerging from the misty tracks of San Francisco like the hulk of a rusting 1978 Morris Marina is one wreck of a game," and labeling it a grade Z stinker. 64 magazine concludes its review by saying that each leg is only worth winning for the marvelous breasts belonging to the bouncy young lady who presents you with your trophy. Because this was the 90s, and gaming magazines were all weirdly horny like this. Seriously, those broccoli-haired zoomers who think things are over-sexualized now have no idea what things used to be like. Now, nostalgia being what it is, I know reviews such as these will have people standing up to defend the game by saying that they loved playing it when they were younger and have many fond memories of it. But as someone with no nostalgic attachment to it, I wanted to see how my own experience compared to that of the critics. As a kid, I always felt that professional critics had it in for Nintendo. I know it was because I was a console fanboy in a time when we got into playground slap fights over which console was better, but I could never shake the feeling that publications such as Next Generation looked down on the N64. Perhaps because it was seen as a system for dumb, stupid kids and not cool, mature adults like the PlayStation. Midway's Cruis'n USA was a very successful 1994 arcade game, and Midway's parent company had partnered with Nintendo to bring 2 of its arcade titles to the Nintendo 64, or Ultra 64 as it was originally going to be called. One of these was Cruis'n USA, and the early marketing suggested that the N64 and the arcade machine were running on the same hardware. In truth, Cruis'n USA ran on the Midway V unit, which had nothing in common with the N64. At least the game actually came out on the console, which is more than can be said about the other arcade game originally destined for the N64.
Available for your home in 1995, only on Nintendo Ultra 64. Killer Instinct.
Now, for the younger viewers out there who grew up after arcades had largely died off, it might be hard to understand why any of this was important. Well, for one thing, arcade games were expensive, at least if you were a kid with no money beyond your parents' allowance. The games themselves were notoriously difficult, designed to gobble up your quarters, and since you didn't want to spend all your money on one machine, you might only get a few minutes of playtime with any one game. And while the hardware of consoles was limited by their need to remain affordable for consumers, arcade machines had no such limits, and thus their hardware was capable of things far beyond what you'd see at home. Take a look at Sega's Galaxy Force if you want to know what I'm talking about. This game came out in 1988. Now compare that to what you'd see on something like an NES or a Sega Master System. Can you imagine how utterly brain-melting these visuals would have been? So having an arcade game available for your home that you can play whenever you want without having to rifle through your sofa cushions for quarters was going to have a lot of appeal. Well, that and Sega and Sony were bringing ports of Daytona USA and Ridge Racer to their consoles, and it's likely that Nintendo didn't want to be left out. Being an arcade racer, Cruis'n USA is as simple as it gets. There are 4 cars to choose from: the Muscle Car, based on the Corvette Stingray, the La Bamba, based on the deluxe Ford Coupe, the Devastator 6, based on the Hyundai Epoch concept car, and the Italia P69, based on the Ferrari Testarossa. Your goal is to race across 14 tracks that will take you from one end of the United States to the next, although I find it rather amusing that for a game called Cruis'n USA, a full half of it takes place in the state of California. I know a lot of game developers are based in California, and that the American Midwest is often dismissed as flyover country, but surely they could have spread things out a little more. You'll have to place first in each race before you can advance, a holdover from the arcade version where failing to place first meant that you had to put more money into the game to continue. And given that this is an arcade port, I think it's only fair to compare the original version with the console port. The arcade version runs at a high resolution, 512 by 400 compared to the N64's 320 by 240, and it lacks any of the console's texture filtering or anti-aliasing, giving the game a sharper, crisper look to it. But while the N64 port lacks the sharpness of the original, it does happen to have a slightly better frame rate. In keeping with Nintendo's family-friendly policies, there are a few changes from the arcade version, and while they're nothing major, they are noticeable. In the arcade version, the manual gearbox is called the XL Power Shaft, but evidently someone at Nintendo thought this was a dick joke and had it changed to XL Power. The girl that appears with a trophy when placing first wears a bikini top in the arcade version, but is a bit more modestly dressed in the console port. Certain stages in the arcade game had animals on the road that would explode into bloody chunks when you ran into them, which was removed for the N64 version. The Money Tunnel in the Washington, D.C. stage has an image of Hillary Clinton smoking a cigar in the arcade game, but on the N64 this was replaced by a regular $100 bill, and the N64 version also removes the shot of President Bill Clinton on a hot tub atop the White House roof. It appears that Midway also thought these things might be objectionable because the arcade version lets you turn them off in the service mode menus. Graphically, Cruis'n USA didn't exactly set the world on fire, which is to be expected considering that it was based on an arcade game that was 2 years old at this point. That might not seem like a long time now, but in the 90s the technology behind 3D graphics was developing at a rapid pace, and as a result, Cruis'n USA just looks dated compared to its contemporaries. The cars themselves look alright. Using digitized photos for the textures helps hide the low polygon count, but the individual tracks aren't very pleasant to look at. Many of the background details are simply two-dimensional sprites, with these copy-pasted smokestacks being a particularly bad example. One of the stages has the player driving towards the Chicago skyline, but as it's just a row of 2D sprites atop an overpass, the whole perspective is completely wrong, making it look as if the player is driving towards a miniature model of the city and not the city itself. The draw distance is also rather short, with distant polygons conspicuously fading into existence as the player drives forward. This was also an issue on the arcade version, but at least on the N64 the background details fade into existence instead of just popping in. Be thankful for small blessings, I guess. The end result is that Cruis'n USA just ends up looking cheap and kind of tacky if I'm being completely honest. I'm sure this all looked a lot more impressive in the arcades of 1994, and playing on a CRT monitor probably helps paper over the rougher edges, but it's all aged quite terribly. Despite having a three-dimensional graphics engine, the heavy use of sprites makes it feel like one of those pseudo-3D racing games like Sega's Outrun that made heavy use of sprite scaling. For a console that was heavily marketed for its 3D graphics, Cruis'n USA isn't a very good showcase of the N64's capabilities, which, again, is because it was a port of a 2-year-old arcade game. And if the graphics are unimpressive, the music and sound effects are downright atrocious. I know the N64 wasn't exactly an audio powerhouse, given that it lacked any dedicated sound hardware, but this game is simply unpleasant to listen to. The music largely consists of these awful, tinny-sounding tracks that just burrow into your brain like an invasive tumor, and even the opening music feels strangely low energy. Could they have said the game's title with any less enthusiasm? And the way the singer keeps going, "Whoa, whoa, whoa," makes me think of a dog in distress. There's this one particularly awful piece of music whose vocal track is just some woman going ooh and ah over and over again, and I wonder if the kids who played this game back in the day had to rush to turn down the TV volume when it started playing, lest their parents think they were watching something far less wholesome than an N64 game. Compare this to Daytona USA if you want a perfect example of music that not only gets you excited about playing a game, it also has the unique ability to cut through the ambient noise of an arcade. The sound effects in Cruis'n USA aren't much better. I mean, seriously, this game barely has any engine noises, so you'll be hurling down the road at breakneck speed in total silence. Again, it just feels cheap. Of course, how a game looks and sounds isn't quite so important as how it plays, and with Cruis'n USA, well, the best word I can find to describe this game's controls is nervous. Maybe it's because most of the racing games I play are simulators like Assetto Corsa, but I could never really get a grip on Cruis'n USA's controls, if you'll forgive the obvious pun, because the game doesn't seem to have any concept of grip at all, leaving Cruis'n USA with this twitchy, jittery feel to it. Moving the thumbstick left or right will have your car lurching and swinging left or right, and it feels very difficult to judge how much you have to steer to make it around a corner without careening off the edge of the road. The arcade game used a steering wheel, which has a much wider range of motion than a thumbstick, and if I had to guess why Cruis'n USA feels so twitchy, then it's because the developer simply shrank that range of motion down to the roughly 2 centimeters of travel of the N64's thumbstick without applying any kind of input curves. Cruis'n USA's physics are interesting, if I were to try and put a positive spin on things. When cars collide in this game, it's a crapshoot as to what will happen next. Quite often they'll start twitching and jittering about erratically or simply warping from one place to another, and when you crash into something hard enough, your car will usually play one of 2 canned animations, where it spins out or flies into the air before it immediately orients itself back to the direction you are facing. As if to emphasize how little the game cares, crossing the finish line has your vehicle immediately coming to a dead stop. Again, it just feels cheap. I know I keep saying that word, but it really is the best way to describe Cruis'n USA. When you play a game like Daytona USA or Ridge Racer, you can clearly tell that the developers put a lot of effort into making sure that the cars felt good to drive, which is clearly not the case in Cruis'n USA. I know that arcade racers like this one aren't supposed to feel realistic, but at no point did I ever feel as if my car were physically interacting with the world. The individual tracks also lack any kind of challenge, being utterly straightforward affairs with almost no tough turns or corners, and there are no shortcuts or alternate routes to break up the monotony. And because your car can turn so sharply, you can run nearly every track flat out without ever having to slow down, which makes me wonder why the developers even bothered to include a brake button, since you almost never need to use it. None of the tracks has any major shifts in elevation, making Cruis'n USA a decidedly horizontal experience and contributing to its dated feel. If the tracks lack variety, then the same goes for the cars, because I'll be damned if I can tell the difference between them. They all handle basically the same, which makes me wonder why Midway even bothered to let players choose their vehicle in the first place. There's not even an attempt at creating any kind of tiers of skill level between them, with some cars having, say, a higher top speed but being harder to handle, so that players are rewarded for mastering a more difficult vehicle. Again, and I know you're sick of hearing this, but it just makes Cruis'n USA feel cheap and low effort. Since the tracks themselves offer little in the way of difficulty, the primary challenge comes from the other racers, and it should not come as a surprise that Cruis'n USA features a rubber band AI, where cars behind you will suddenly gain speed in order to catch up. You can't really have a commanding lead in this game, and if you make so much as a single mistake, like colliding with a truck that you couldn't see coming because it was at the top of a hill, then you'll be forced to watch in despair as a half-dozen cars go flying past you. The system isn't entirely unfair, of course, as falling behind will have the rubber band system working in your favor, but it's still incredibly frustrating to lose a race not because of a mistake on your part, but because the computer opponent got a burst of speed all of a sudden. And that's a problem considering that Cruis'n USA requires you to place first in order to continue. But I think one of the most damning criticisms of Cruis'n USA is that you can see everything it has to offer in the span of an afternoon. There are some additional vehicles you can unlock, and there's always the split-screen 2-player mode, but for the most part there's not a whole lot in terms of content, which is to be expected considering that it's a port of an arcade game, and arcade games were typically made to be played in short sessions.
I love this job!
Midway Games always had this goofy, devil-may-care attitude, whether it was Mortal Kombat or NFL Blitz or Rampage World Tour or what have you. They were the perfect games to rent over the weekend when all you wanted was some mindless fun. As I said in my video on Quest 64, kids growing up in the 90s experienced games in a very different way than adults do in the present. Video games were expensive, and getting to own one was a rare treat reserved for Christmas and birthday presents. I only ever had 5 N64 games. The rest of the games I played were simply rented for the weekend, games that weren't necessarily critical darlings, but which I still fondly remember. And I'm sure that, for a lot of people, Cruis'n USA falls into this category. It's flawed, yes, but I don't think it quite deserves the dire scores it got from critics. I think the worst thing you can say about it is that if you're looking to play a racing game on the N64, then there are plenty others to choose from, and Cruis'n USA doesn't really do anything to stand out from the pack. For that reason, I'm confident saying that you can probably give this one a miss.